They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but I disagree entirely. I believe revenge should be served like a fine perfume. It should be complex and intoxicating, and it should linger in the room long after you are gone. My name is Helena Vane, and for the last 10 years, I have been a ghost. I watched from the shadows of a tiny apartment in Paris as the man I loved stole my life, my company, and my name. Today, Silas Thorne thinks he is securing his legacy. He thinks he is untouchable high up in that glass tower, overlooking the French Quarter. But he forgot one simple thing. He forgot that I am the one who taught him everything he knows. He forgot that I know the formula to his destruction. And by the time the sun sets over the bayou tonight, he will wish he had never caught my scent. The humidity in New Orleans hits you like a physical weight the moment you step off the plane. It is a thick, heavy blanket of moisture that carries the smell of old river water and blooming jasmine and frying beignets. For 10 years, I had only smelled the crisp, dry air of the French countryside. But the moment that Louisiana air filled my lungs, I felt my blood heat up. I was home. I stood outside the wrought iron gates of the Thorne estate, which used to be the Vane estate, before my signature was forged on the deed. Tonight was the annual masquerade ball. It was the social event of the season where the wealthy elite of the South came to drink champagne and pretend they had no sins to hide. I adjusted the gold Venetian mask over my eyes. It covered the upper half of my face completely, leaving only my mouth and chin exposed. I had chosen a dress of deep midnight blue velvet. It was heavy and regal, and it made me feel like an armored queen returning to reclaim her throne. The security guard at the gate barely glanced at my invitation. It was a forgery, of course, but a perfect one. I walked up the long driveway lined with ancient oak trees. The Spanish moss hung down like gray beards brushing against the tops of the luxury cars. I remembered planting the hydrangeas along this path with my own hands 30 years ago. Now they were overgrown and wild, just like the ambition of the man living inside the house. I entered the ballroom, and the noise washed over me. The clinking of crystal glasses and the swell of a string quartet and the murmur of gossip. But being a master perfumer means I experience the world through my nose first. And what I smelled made my stomach turn. It was everywhere. The signature scent of Maison Vane. We called it Midnight Orchid. I had spent 5 years developing that formula. It was supposed to smell like vanilla and dark wood and a secret whispered in the dark. But the scent filling this ballroom was wrong. It was sharp and metallic. It smelled synthetic. Silas had changed the formula. He was using cheap chemical substitutes to save money, and he was charging these people hundreds of dollars for what was essentially colored water. It was an insult to my art, and it was an insult to me. I moved through the crowd like a shark in dark water. I saw faces I recognized, old friends who had turned their backs on me when the scandal broke. They looked older and tired beneath their diamond masks. I felt a surge of power knowing they had no idea the woman standing next to them was the pariah they had exiled. Then I saw him. Silas Thorne was standing on the grand staircase holding a glass of scotch. He looked infuriatingly handsome. His hair had turned a distinguished silver, and his tuxedo fit him perfectly. He was laughing at something a young woman was whispering in his ear. That charm, that deadly, easy charm that had convinced me to give him the keys to my kingdom. I felt a tremor in my hands, but I forced myself to be steady. I took a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and drank it in one swallow. Then I began to climb the stairs. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every step brought me closer to the man who ruined me. When I reached the top step, he turned. He felt my presence before he saw me. That was always our connection. He could sense when I walked into a room, even if his back was turned. He looked at me. His eyes were dark behind his black mask. He didn't recognize me yet. He just saw a woman in a blue velvet dress who carried herself with an air of authority. He smiled that practiced politician smile and said, "Well, hello there. I haven't seen you at these parties before. Are you a friend of the family?" I stepped closer until I could smell his cologne. It was sandalwood and vetiver. The same scent he wore the night he told me he loved me. The same scent he wore the night he testified against me in court. I leaned in close to his ear so only he could hear me. I let my voice drop to a low whisper, the same tone I used to use when we were lying in bed planning our future. I said, "Hello, Silas. The perfume in the air tonight smells cheap, just like your promises." He froze. His entire body went rigid. The smile vanished from his face instantly. He grabbed my wrist, his grip tight and painful. He pulled me slightly away from the crowd, his eyes searching my face behind the gold mask. He hissed, "Who are you?" I reached up slowly and untied the silk ribbon at the back of my head. The mask fell away into my hand. I looked him dead in the eye and saw the color drain from his face. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. I smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I said, "Happy anniversary, Silas. Did you miss me?" The look on Silas's face was worth every single lonely night I had spent in exile. For a fleeting second, the great Silas Thorne looked like a terrified little boy caught stealing sweets from the kitchen jar. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The shock had frozen his vocal cords. I didn't wait for him to recover. I turned on my heel and walked away into the crowd. I knew he wouldn't cause a scene. Not here. Not in front of the investors and the mayor and the press. Silas cared more about his image than he did about the truth, and that vanity was his greatest weakness. As I moved through the ballroom, I let my mind drift back to the day my life ended 10 years ago. It was a Tuesday. I remember it was raining hard against the glass walls of my office. The kind of relentless tropical rain that drowns out all other sound. 2 police officers were standing at my desk. They were polite, but firm. They held up a folder of documents. Bank transfers, corporate blueprints, emails sent from my private server to a rival firm in China. It was a masterclass in forgery. Every piece of evidence had been planted with surgical precision. And sitting in the corner of the office with his head in his hands was Silas. He was acting the part of the heartbroken partner perfectly. He looked at the police and said he had tried to stop me. He said he had suspected I was selling our secrets, but he didn't want to believe it. He looked at me with tears in his eyes, and I almost believed him myself. That is how good he was. I was escorted out of my own building in handcuffs while the staff watched in silence. I lost everything that afternoon. My reputation, my assets, my dignity. But tonight, I wasn't looking for redemption. I was looking for an ally. I scanned the room for the one person who might still have a drop of Vane blood running through her veins that wasn't poisoned by Silas's lies. I found her standing near the catering entrance. Lydia Vane, my granddaughter. She didn't look like the other women at the party. She wasn't wearing diamonds or silk. She was wearing a simple black dress that looked like a uniform. She was holding a tray of empty champagne flutes. My heart broke a little. Silas had reduced the heir to the throne to a servant. He kept her close enough to control her, but low enough to humiliate her. I walked up to her. She looked tired. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a severe bun, but I could see her father in her eyes. I could see my son. I stopped in front of her, and she instinctively offered me the tray. She said, "Would you like another glass, madame?" I shook my head and said no. "Lydia, I am not thirsty." She froze. She looked up at me sharp and wary. She recognized me. Of course she did. My face had been plastered on every newspaper in the state as the disgraced CEO. She lowered the tray and her voice turned into cold steel. She said, "You need to leave. If security sees you, they will call the police." I said, "Let them call. I am done running, Lydia. I came back for what is mine, and I came back for you." She let out a harsh, bitter laugh. She said for me, "You left me. You stole from this company and you ran away to France, and you left me alone with him. Do you know what it was like growing up in this house, with the shadow of your crimes hanging over me?" I stepped closer. I could smell lemon polish on her hands and the faint chemical scent of the laboratory. She had been working in the lab. She had the nose. She had the gift. I said I never stole a dime. Silas framed me because I wouldn't let him sell the company to a conglomerate that wanted to strip it for parts. And look around you, Lydia. Look at this party. Smell the perfume in the air. It is synthetic garbage. He has destroyed everything I built. She looked around the room, and for a second I saw a crack in her armor. She knew the perfume was bad. She was a Vane. She knew quality, and this wasn't it. She whispered, "He says you are delusional. He says you are sick." I said, "He is a liar, and I can prove it. But I need your help. I need to get into the main vault. My original journals are in there. The ones that prove the Midnight Orchid formula belongs to me." Lydia looked at the security guards by the door, then back at me. She looked torn. She was angry, but she was also curious. The scientist in her wanted to know the truth, but then she shook her head and stepped back. She said, "It doesn't matter, Grandma. You are too late." I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I asked, "What do you mean, too late?" Lydia leaned in close and lowered her voice. She said Silas isn't just celebrating his retirement tonight. He is signing the papers on Friday morning. He is selling the entire company to Omnicorp. My blood ran cold. Omnicorp was a factory farming of the perfume world. They bought luxury brands and turned them into mass-market cheap sprays sold in drugstores. They would bulldoze the lab. They would burn the archives. Lydia continued. She said, "In 72 hours, Maison Vane will cease to exist. If you want to save it, you don't need a miracle. You need a war. 72 hours." That was all the time I had left to save a legacy that took 3 generations to build. I looked at Lydia, and I saw the hesitation in her eyes, but I also saw the spark of rebellion. She had spent her entire adult life being told she wasn't good enough by a man who couldn't tell the difference between rose oil and turpentine. She was hungry for the truth, and tonight I was going to feed it to her. I told her that if Omnicorp takes over on Friday, they won't keep her on as an intern. They will fire everyone and move production to a factory in New Jersey. I told her this was her only chance to see what real perfumery looked like before it was destroyed forever. She didn't say yes immediately. She just nodded once, sharp and quick. She told me to meet her at the service entrance in 20 minutes. I waited in the shadows of the loading dock. The air here smelled of diesel fumes and wet cardboard, a stark contrast to the expensive cologne inside the ballroom. When the heavy steel door creaked open, Lydia was there. She had changed out of her serving dress into a white lab coat. It was too big for her, hanging off her shoulders like a child playing dress-up. But the way she held the keycard was steady. We walked through the silent corridors of the manufacturing wing. The hum of the ventilation system was the only sound. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that I used to find comforting, like the heartbeat of the building. Now it just sounded mechanical and cold. Lydia swiped her card at the entrance to the main laboratory. The light turned green with a soft beep, and we stepped inside. My heart sank. The lab, I remembered, was a chaotic, beautiful mess of glass beakers and dried flowers and handwritten notes pinned to corkboards. It was a place of alchemy and magic. But this room looked like a hospital operating theater. Everything was stainless steel and white plastic. There were no raw ingredients on the tables, only rows of computers and mass spectrometers. It smelled of ozone and industrial cleaner. There was no soul here. Lydia walked over to a secure door at the back of the room. This was the vault. It was where we kept the master formulas, the literal gold bars of our industry. She typed a code into the keypad. Her fingers moved so fast I couldn't track them. She said Silas changes the codes every week, but he is lazy. He uses the birthdays of his mistresses. The heavy door hissed open. The air inside the vault was climate-controlled, cool and dry to preserve the paper and the oils. I rushed past Lydia to the shelf where the founding journals were kept. My father's journals. My journals. The leather-bound books that contained the secret of the midnight orchid. I reached for the shelf labeled 1985 to 1995. My hand closed on empty air. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. I frantically checked the other shelves. I pulled out boxes and shoved aside stacks of legal papers. The shelf was empty. The journals were gone. I turned to Lydia and I felt the panic rising in my throat. I said, "They are not here." He moved them. Lydia looked confused. She said, "That is impossible. Silas never comes down here. He hates the lab." I paced the small room, my mind racing. If the journals weren't here, then I had no proof. Without those formulas, I was just a crazy old woman making wild accusations. I needed to think. Where would a man like Silas hide the most valuable thing he owns? He wouldn't put it in a bank. He wouldn't trust a bank. He would keep it close. Then I saw it. On the empty shelf where my journals should have been, there was a single object. It was a small crystal bottle. I picked it up. It was empty, but when I uncorked it, I caught a faint scent. It smelled of burnt sugar and old leather. I knew that smell. It wasn't a perfume ingredient. It was the smell of the library in the east wing of the manor. Silas's private study. He hadn't destroyed the journals. He was keeping them as trophies. I turned to Lydia and said, "We need to go to the house. We need to go to his study." But before Lydia could answer, the room suddenly plunged into darkness. The hum of the ventilation system cut out and was replaced by a deafening silence. Then the red emergency lights began to flash. Pulse, pulse, pulse. Lydia grabbed my arm, her grip terrified. She whispered, "Oh God, the silent alarm." We triggered the silent alarm. We heard the heavy thud of footsteps running down the corridor outside. Heavy boots. Security. They were coming from both ends of the hallway. We were trapped in a glass box with nowhere to hide. I looked at Lydia. She looked like she was about to faint. I grabbed her shoulders and shook her hard. I said, "Listen to me. Do you know the ventilation shafts? Do you know where the intake vents are?" She nodded, eyes wide. She said, "Yes, but they are too small." I said, "Not for us." "Show me. Now." The footsteps were getting louder. I could hear the radio chatter of the guards. They were right outside the main lab door. We had maybe 10 seconds before they swiped their cards and found us standing there like rats in a trap. The metal grate of the ventilation shaft was rusted shut, but fear is a powerful lubricant. Lydia kicked it once hard with the heel of her sensible work shoe, and it groaned open. I didn't hesitate. I shoved her through the opening first and scrambled in after her just as the magnetic locks on the lab door disengaged. We were in the crawl space between the ceiling and the roof. It was tight and hot, and it smelled of dead rats and decades of dust. Below us, we could hear the heavy boots of the security guards storming the lab. I heard them shouting clear, and I heard the crash of equipment being overturned. They were looking for intruders, but they were looking on the ground. They forgot to look up. We crawled on our hands and knees for what felt like miles. My velvet dress was ruined. My knees were bleeding, but I felt alive. For 10 years I had been asleep, and now I was finally awake. The shaft eventually dumped us out into the old laundry chute that fed into the basement. We slid down into a pile of dirty linen sheets, like discarded toys. We lay there for a moment, panting in the darkness. Lydia was shaking. She was crying softly. She said, "We are going to jail." She said, "My life is over." I grabbed her hand. It was cold and clammy. I said, "Listen to me, Lydia. Your life is just beginning. We know where the journals are now." I smelled the library on that empty bottle. Silas is keeping them in his study like a dragon guarding his gold. We can't go back there tonight because the house is on lockdown, but we don't need to steal them in the dark. We are going to make him give them to us. The next morning, I traded my ruined velvet gown for a white power suit I bought with the last of my cash. I slicked my hair back and put on my dark sunglasses. I looked like a shark in human clothing. I knew Silas's schedule better than I knew my own prayers. Every Wednesday at noon, he had lunch at Galatoire's on Bourbon Street with the key investors. It was a tradition we started together 30 years ago. It was where we closed our biggest deals. I walked into the restaurant at 12:15. The maitre d' tried to stop me, but I just looked at him over the rim of my glasses and he stepped aside. He remembered me. He remembered the tips I used to leave. The dining room was loud and crowded, but the noise died down as I walked through the center aisle. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Forks hovered halfway to mouths. I ignored them all. My eyes were locked on the corner table. Silas was there. He was surrounded by 3 men in gray suits. The investors from Omnicorp. They were laughing at a joke Silas had just told. I pulled out the empty chair directly across from Silas and sat down. The silence at the table was deafening. Silas's fork clattered onto his plate. His face went from flushed to pale in a heartbeat. I smiled and picked up a breadstick. I said, "Gentlemen, I apologize for being late. Traffic coming in from the airport was murder, but I simply had to be here to discuss the acquisition." One of the Omnicorp men looked confused. He asked Silas, "Who is this?" I answered before Silas could speak. I said, "I am the woman who built the engine of the car you're about to buy, and I am here to tell you that the engine is broken." Silas slammed his hand on the table. He hissed, "You have no business being here, Helena. Security will drag you out." I laughed. It was a light, airy sound that didn't reach my eyes. I said, "Oh, I don't think so, Silas. Not unless you want me to tell these nice gentlemen about the chemical burns our test subjects suffered last month because you switched to cheaper ethanol." The investors looked at each other nervously. They didn't know if it was true or not, but the doubt was there. And in business, doubt is poison. I leaned forward. I said, "The stock price is already wobbling, Silas. If I walk out of here and call the Wall Street Journal, the deal is dead by sunset." For a moment, I thought I had him. I saw the fear in his eyes. I saw the sweat beading on his forehead. But then a slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He reached into his jacket pocket. He didn't pull out a phone or a weapon. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and slid it across the white tablecloth. He said, "You always were dramatic, Helena, but you are playing a game you lost 10 years ago." I looked at the paper. It was a restraining order. But paper clipped to the back was a photograph. My heart stopped. It was a photo of the old family vineyard in Provence, the place where I had been living in exile, the place where my mother was buried, the place where I grew the rare orchids that were the source of my power. Silas leaned in close, his voice a serpentine whisper. He said I bought the mortgage on your little hideaway this morning, Helena. If you say one more word to these investors, I will bulldoze that vineyard into the dirt. I will pave over your mother's grave and turn it into a parking lot. He sat back and took a sip of his wine. He said, "Now run along. The adults are talking." I walked out of the restaurant and into the blinding midday sun of Bourbon Street. The heat rose off the pavement in shimmering waves, making the world look distorted and dreamlike. I felt sick. Not the sickness of a flu, but the deep, hollow nausea of total defeat. I had walked into that lunch like a lioness, ready to tear out a throat, and I had walked out like a whipped dog. I clutched the folded papers in my hand so tightly the edges cut into my palm. A parking lot. He was going to turn the only place I had left in this world into a slab of concrete. My mother's rose garden. The drying shed where I first learned to distill lavender. The oak tree where I buried my husband's ashes. Silas knew exactly where to strike. He didn't go for the money, he went for the heart. Lydia was waiting for me around the corner near a jazz club that was quiet for the afternoon. She saw my face and she knew immediately that something had gone wrong. She didn't ask. She just took my arm and led me to a bench in the shade. She said, "Grandma, you are shaking. Sit down. I will get you some water." I shook my head. I handed her the papers. I said, "Look at this, Lydia. He bought the vineyard. He owns the mortgage. If I don't stop fighting him by midnight tonight, he is going to bulldoze it." Lydia read the document. Her eyes went wide. She whispered, "He can't do this. This is extortion." I laughed bitterly. I said, "This is business, Lydia, and Silas is very good at business. I have to choose. Do I save the company that bears my name, or do I save the home that holds my memories? I cannot have both." I felt old. For the first time since I landed in New Orleans, I felt every single one of my 68 years. Maybe I should just give up. Maybe I should just sign the papers, let him sell to Omnicorp and go back to France. I could save the vineyard. I could live out my days in peace and let the Vane legacy rot. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the brick wall. I lifted the papers to my face to wipe the sweat from my forehead. And that is when I smelled it. It was faint. Most people would never have noticed it over the smell of the street and the ink on the page. But I am not most people. I have a nose that can detect a single drop of jasmine oil in a swimming pool of water. I smelled the paper again. I inhaled deep and slow, letting the scent molecules hit the back of my olfactory receptor. It wasn't Silas's cologne. It wasn't the metallic smell of the Omnicorp investors. It was a scent I knew as well as my own breathing. Pipe, tobacco, peppermint, and old leather. My eyes snapped open. The exhaustion vanished. It was replaced by a cold, sharp rage. Lydia looked at me concerned. She asked, "What is it? What's wrong?" I said, "Smell this paper, Lydia, right here on the signature line." "What do you smell?" She leaned in and sniffed. She scrunched up her nose. She said it smells like mint and smoke. I nodded slowly. I said exactly. Silas doesn't smoke, and he hates peppermint. But do you know who loves pipe tobacco and peppermint candies? Do you know who has smelled like that every day for 40 years? Lydia's face went pale. She whispered Marcus. Marcus Sterling. My family lawyer. The man who sat at my dinner table every Sunday for 2 decades. The man who held my hand at my husband's funeral. The man who swore to me 10 years ago that he had done everything he could to stop the hostile takeover, but Silas had outmaneuvered him. He hadn't been outmaneuvered. He had been bought. The papers in my hand weren't just a threat. They were a confession. Marcus had drafted this mortgage transfer. He was the one who helped Silas find the shell company to buy my debt. He was the architect of my destruction. I stood up. My legs felt strong again. The heat didn't bother me anymore. Lydia stood up with me. She said, "Where are we going? Are we going back to the hotel?" I looked at her and I smiled. It was a dangerous smile. I said, "No, Lydia. We are not going to the hotel. We are going to pay a visit to an old friend." I looked at the time. It was 2:00. Marcus would be in his office in the Garden District. He would be sitting in his leather chair, eating a peppermint, and thinking he was safe. He thought I was beaten. He thought I was crying over a vineyard. He forgot that when you back a wolf into a corner, you don't get a surrender. You get teeth. I smoothed down my white suit. I put my sunglasses back on. I said, "Come on, Lydia. I need a witness. And bring your phone. We are going to record everything." The law offices of Sterling and Associates were located in a converted antebellum mansion in the Garden District. It was the kind of place that screamed old money and discreet silences. The floors were marble, the paneling was mahogany, and the receptionist looked like she had been sitting at that desk since the Eisenhower administration. She looked up over her spectacles as Lydia and I burst through the heavy double doors. She opened her mouth to ask if we had an appointment, but I didn't give her the chance. I walked past her desk with the momentum of a freight train. I said, "Tell Marcus his 2:00 is here, and tell him it is urgent." I pushed open the door to his private office without knocking. Marcus Sterling was sitting behind a desk that was large enough to land a plane on. He was unwrapping a peppermint candy with shaking fingers. The room smelled exactly like the legal papers Silas had given me. It was a suffocating mix of stale smoke and sweet mint. He looked up and the candy dropped from his hand onto the blotter. His face went gray. He looked like a man who had just seen his own obituary printed in the morning paper. He stammered, "Helena. I didn't know you were in town." I closed the door behind me and locked it. Lydia stood by the entrance holding her phone up, filming everything. I walked over to the leather chair opposite his desk and sat down slowly. I crossed my legs and adjusted my sunglasses. I said, "Cut the act, Marcus. I know you helped Silas buy the mortgage on my vineyard. I smelled your tobacco on the deed. You always were sloppy with your vices." Marcus tried to regain his composure. He smoothed his tie and put on his lawyer face. It was a mask I had seen him wear 1,000 times in court, but now it looked thin and brittle. He said, "I am just doing my job, Helena. Silas is my client now. You know how it works. Conflict of interest doesn't apply when one party has been declared legally incompetent to run a business." I felt a flash of white-hot anger, but I kept my voice low and even. I said incompetent. Is that what we are calling it now? Is that what you told yourself 10 years ago when you helped him plant those fake bank transfers on my server? Did you tell yourself you were doing it for the good of the company? Or did you do it because Silas paid off your gambling debts? Marcus flinched. His eyes darted to Lydia and the phone. He hissed, "You have no proof of that." "That is slander." I leaned forward. I placed my hands flat on his desk. I said, I don't need proof for a court of law, Marcus. I am not looking for a settlement. I am looking for leverage. I know about the trust fund you embezzled from the violent widow in 2005. I know about the bribes you paid to the zoning commissioner. His face crumbled. The arrogance vanished, leaving only a frightened old man. I continued. I said, if I walk out of here, I am going to the Bar Association. You will be disbarred by the end of the week. You will lose this office. You will lose your house. You will die in a prison cell, Marcus. Is Silas Thorne worth that? The silence in the room was heavy. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Tick, tick, tick. Measuring out the remaining seconds of his career. Marcus slumped in his chair. He took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. He looked defeated. He whispered, What do you want, Helena? I said I want the truth. Where are the journals? We know they aren't at the house. Marcus sighed. A long, rattling sound. He said Silas got paranoid after the silent alarm tripped last night. He moved them this morning. He said he couldn't trust the house security anymore. I demanded where Marcus. He looked at me, his eyes watery and red. He said the First Bank of New Orleans, the private vault in the basement. He rented a safety deposit box this morning. Box number 404. I nodded. A bank vault. That made things harder, but not impossible. I stood up. I said, Thank you, Marcus. That wasn't so hard, was it? But Marcus shook his head. He let out a dry, humorless laugh. He said, It doesn't matter, Helena. You can't get into that box. It isn't a key lock. It's the new biometric system. It requires a retinal scan and a fingerprint. Unless you plan on cutting off Silas's hand, you will never see those journals again. I stopped at the door. I looked back at him. I said, Never underestimate a woman who has nothing left to lose. I unlocked the door and motioned for Lydia to follow me. We walked out of the office, leaving Marcus staring at the wall, wondering if he had just signed his own death warrant. Out on the street, Lydia grabbed my arm. She was breathless. She said, Grandma, how are we going to get Silas's fingerprint? We can't exactly ask him for it. I checked my watch. It was 4 p.m. I said, Tonight is the mayor's charity gala. Silas will be there. He has to be there to court the press before the sale on Friday. Lydia looked confused. She said, So what? We just walk up to him and ask him to touch a piece of glass. I smiled. I thought about the chemistry of adhesion. I thought about the polymers I used to use to bind scents to skin. I said, Not exactly. I need you to go to the lab supply store. I need cyanoacrylate fuming powder and a high-resolution molding gel. Lydia's eyes went wide. She realized what I was planning. She whispered, You are going to lift his print off a glass while he is drinking. I said no. That is too risky. Glasses get wiped. Glasses break. I am going to get his print directly from the source. I am going to shake his hand, and when I let go, I will have everything I need to destroy him. The molding gel was cold against my skin. It was a clear, fast-acting silicone polymer that I had mixed in the hotel sink using the supplies Lydia bought. I had painted a thin, invisible layer onto the palm of my right hand. It felt like I was wearing a second skin, a glove made of spiderwebs. If I touched anything, it would ruin the surface. I had to keep my hand open, and I had to keep it steady. We arrived at the mayor's charity gala at 8 o'clock. The ballroom was a sea of black ties and designer gowns. The air smelled of expensive flowers and the metallic tang of chilled seafood. Lydia was walking beside me. She looked terrified. She was wringing her hands and scanning the room for security. I leaned in close to her ear. I whispered, Stop it. You look guilty. Stand up straight. You are a Vane. You own this room." She took a deep breath and nodded. She broke away to circulate near the exits, ready to create a distraction if things went south. I spotted Silas near the orchestra pit. He was holding court with the CEO of Omnicorp, a short man with a red face and a loud laugh. Silas looked relaxed. He looked like a man who had already won the war. He didn't know the enemy was walking right up to his flank. I moved through the crowd. I held my right hand slightly away from my body, protecting the gel. I needed a firm grip. 3 seconds of contact. That was all it took for the polymer to mold to the ridges of his skin. I waited for a break in the conversation. When the Omnicorp CEO stepped away to get a drink, I made my move. I walked right up to Silas. He saw me and his eyes narrowed. He looked around for security, but I raised my left hand in a gesture of surrender. I said, "Relax, Silas. I am not here to cause a scene. I am here to concede." He looked at me with suspicion, but also with curiosity. His ego wanted to believe me. He wanted to hear me say the words. He said, "Is that so, Helena? You had a lot of fire in you yesterday at lunch. What changed?" I sighed. It was a heavy, defeated sound. I said, "I realized you were right. I am tired, Silas. I am 68 years old. I don't want to spend my last years fighting lawyers and losing my home. You win. You can have the company. Just let me keep the vineyard. That is all I ask." Silas watched my face closely. He was looking for the lie. I let my shoulders slump. I let the sadness I truly felt about the vineyard show in my eyes. It wasn't acting. It was the truth used as a weapon. He smiled. It was a shark's smile. He enjoyed seeing me beg. He said, "I think that can be arranged, Helena. I am not a monster. If you sign a non-disclosure agreement, I will tear up the mortgage deed." I nodded. I said, "Thank you, Silas. That is very generous of you." I extended my right hand. The hand with the gel. I said, for old time's sake, "No hard feelings." Silas looked at my hand. For a split second, he hesitated, but the allure of the victory was too strong. He wanted to seal the deal. He wanted to feel my capitulation physically. He reached out and grasped my hand. I squeezed. I felt his skin press against the polymer. I felt the heat of his palm. I counted in my head. 1, 2, 3. I had the print. It was perfect. I started to pull my hand away. I needed to get to the ladies' room immediately to peel off the layer and secure the mold. But Silas didn't let go. His grip tightened. He frowned. He rubbed his thumb against my palm. He felt the texture of the silicone. He felt the unnatural smoothness that didn't feel like human skin. He looked down at our joined hands. He saw the faint sheen of the gel. His eyes snapped up to mine, and the triumph in them was replaced by cold fury. He realized instantly what I had done. He was a paranoid man, and his paranoia had just been validated. He hissed, "What is this? What is on your hand?" He yanked my hand up towards his face to inspect it. I tried to pull back, but he was stronger than me. He dug his fingernails into my palm, threatening to tear the delicate mold I had just created. He snarled, "You are trying to lift my prince, you witch!" People were starting to turn. The orchestra was playing a waltz, but the bubble of tension around us was expanding. I was trapped. He had my hand in a vice grip. If he peeled the gel off now, it would be over. The evidence would be destroyed, and he would call the police and have me arrested for assault. I looked around for Lydia, but she was on the other side of the room. I was alone. Silas squeezed my hand harder, crushing my fingers. He lowered his voice to a menacing growl. He said, "Did you really think you could outsmart me with a parlor trick? I am going to call security, and I'm going to have them strip search you right here in front of the mayor." He reached into his pocket with his free hand and pulled out his phone. He was dialing the head of security. I had 1 second to make a decision. I couldn't pull away. I couldn't run. So I did the only thing he wouldn't expect. I stepped closer to him. I moved into his personal space until our chests were almost touching. And I smiled. I leaned into Silas until I could see the red veins in his eyes. I kept my voice lower than the music, a whisper that was only for him. I said, "Go ahead, Silas. Call them. Tell the police I tried to steal a fingerprint. But while they are dragging me away, ask yourself one question. Why is the midnight orchid turning sour in the bottles?" Silas froze. His thumb stopped digging into my palm. The phone in his other hand lowered just an inch. I pressed my advantage. I said I smelled it in the ballroom yesterday. I smelled the decay. You are using synthetic fixatives because you couldn't decipher my journals. You don't know the final stabilization step. Without me, that perfume will turn to vinegar before the ink is dry on the Omnicorp contract. Silas stared at me. The anger in his face was fighting a war with his greed. He knew I was right. He was a businessman, but he was selling a product he didn't understand. If the perfume failed during the final demonstration on Friday, the deal would collapse. He would lose millions. He slowly put the phone back in his pocket, but he didn't let go of my hand. Instead, he pulled me roughly toward the French doors leading to the balcony. We stepped out into the humid night air. The noise of the party faded behind the glass. We were alone in the dark. Silas released my hand. He took out a handkerchief and wiped his own palm as if my touch had contaminated him. He said, "You are a dangerous woman, Helena. You always were." I peeled the ruined silicone off my hand like dead skin and flicked it over the balcony railing. It disappeared into the bushes below. The heist was over. The plan had failed, but a new door had just opened. I said, "I am not dangerous, Silas. I am just a professional. And you are an amateur trying to fly a jet plane. You are going to crash and burn on Friday, and I am going to enjoy watching it from my jail cell." Silas walked to the edge of the balcony and looked out at the city skyline. He was silent for a long time. I could see the gears turning in his head. He was calculating risk versus reward. Finally, he turned back to me. His face was composed again. The mask was back in place. He said, "I have a proposition for you." I crossed my arms. I said, "I am listening." He said, "Come back to the lab tomorrow morning. Fix the formula. Make the batch for the Friday signing ceremony perfectly stable. If you do that, I will give you the vineyard, free and clear. And I will give you 5% of the sale price." It was a deal with the devil. He was asking me to help him sell the company I built. He was asking me to help him win. But as I stood there, I realized that this was the only way back inside. I couldn't break into the vault. I couldn't steal the journals. But if he invited me in, I would have access to everything. The chemicals, the equipment, the heating elements. I looked him in the eye. I didn't blink. I said, "Make it 10%. And I want a written apology for the theft 10 years ago. Not for the public. Just for me." Silas laughed. It was a bark of surprise. He said, "You are in no position to negotiate, Helena." I turned to walk back inside. I said, "Then enjoy explaining to Omnicorp why their flagship product smells like cat urine." He stepped in front of me. He held out his hand. He said, "Done. 10%. But no letter." "I never admit to crimes, Helena. You know that." I looked at his outstretched hand. The hand that had ruined my life. I knew I was selling my soul. But I also knew that sometimes to kill a beast, you have to let it swallow you whole. I shook his hand. "I said I will see you at the lab at 6 a.m. Don't be late." I walked back through the party, leaving him on the balcony. I found Lydia near the cloakroom. She looked pale and anxious. She saw me coming and rushed forward. She whispered, "Did you get it? Did you get the print?" I shook my head. I said no. The plan changed. Lydia looked at my clean hands. She looked at the calm expression on my face. She realized something was wrong. She asked Grandma, "What did you do?" I said, "I made a deal, Lydia. I am going back to work for Silas. I am going to finish the perfume for him." Lydia stepped back, as if I had slapped her. Her eyes filled with tears of betrayal. She said, "You can't be serious. After everything he did to you, after everything he did to us, you are going to help him win. You are just like him. You care more about the money than the truth." She turned and ran out the door into the night. I watched her go. My heart ached. I wanted to run after her and explain. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't going back to the lab to make perfume. I was going back to make a bomb. Not an explosive one, but a chemical one. A time bomb that would go off right under Silas's nose. But I couldn't tell her. Not yet. Her anger had to be real. If she knew the truth, she might give it away. I walked out of the gala alone. The night air smelled of rain and ozone. It was the smell of a storm coming. And this time, I was the storm. The laboratory at 6 a.m. was a cold and sterile place. The hum of the air filtration system was the only sound in the room until the heavy door swished open and Silas walked in. He was holding a cup of black coffee and wearing a look of smug satisfaction. He thought he had broken me. He thought he had purchased my loyalty for the price of a vineyard and 10% of a company he was about to destroy. He didn't know that loyalty is like glass. Once it is broken, you can glue it back together, but it will always be fragile. And if you press too hard, it will cut you. I didn't look at him. I was already at the main workstation. I had arranged the raw ingredients in a semicircle around me. Ambergris from New Zealand, bergamot from Calabria, jasmine absolute from Grasse. These were the notes of a symphony I had written 30 years ago. Silas pulled up a stool and sat just outside my personal space. He was watching me like a hawk watching a field mouse. He said, "Make it good, Helena. The buyers will be here at 10 tomorrow morning. I want them to weep when they smell it." I reached for the beaker of ethanol. I said, "Perfume is chemistry, Silas. It isn't magic. You can't rush the maceration process." He laughed soft and low. He said, "You are the great Helena Vane. You can do anything. That is why I kept you around for so long." I felt a surge of bile in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I focused on the work. My hands moved with a muscle memory that defied age. I measured. I mixed. I stirred. The scent began to rise from the beaker. It was rich and dark and floral. It was the midnight orchid exactly as it was meant to be. But then came the moment of the turn. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small vial I had smuggled in. It contained a chemical compound called indole. In small doses, indole smells like jasmine. It is floral and heady, but in high concentrations, or when exposed to body heat for too long, it breaks down. It reverts to its baser nature. It starts to smell of decay. It smells like rotting meat and fecal matter. I needed to add just enough to fool the initial sniff test, but enough to turn rancid once it settled on warm skin. It was a chemical time bomb. I uncorked the vial. My hand hovered over the main mixture. Silas leaned forward. His eyes narrowed. He asked, "What is that?" "That isn't in the original formula." My heart skipped a beat. He was paying closer attention than I thought. I didn't flinch. I held the vial up to the light so he could see the clear liquid. I lied. I said, "This is a stabilizer, Silas." You said the current batches were turning sour. This prevents oxidation. It locks the scent in. He looked at me suspicious. He sniffed the air. Since the indole was cold, it just smelled like intense flowers. He relaxed. He nodded. He said, "All right, carry on." I tipped the vial. 3 drops, 4 drops, 5. I watched the clear liquid swirl into the golden perfume. The trap was set. The poison was in the chalice. I stirred the mixture for another hour. I watched the color settle into a perfect pale gold. It looked innocent. It looked expensive. It looked like victory. I decanted the perfume into the crystal presentation bottle. I sealed it with a wax stopper. I wiped my hands on my apron and turned to Silas. "I said it is done. This is the master batch. Keep it in the climate-controlled vault until the meeting tomorrow. Do not open it. Do not expose it to heat." Silas stood up. He walked over to the bottle and picked it up. He held it up to the fluorescent light, admiring the clarity. He said, "Beautiful. Simply beautiful." I started to untie my apron. I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to find Lydia and explain everything before she did something rash. My nerves were frayed to the breaking point. I said, "I will see you at the signing ceremony, Silas. Don't forget my check." I turned to leave, but then I heard the sound of the wax stopper being pulled out. Pop! I froze. I spun around. Silas was holding the open bottle under his nose. He was inhaling deeply. He smiled. He said, "It smells divine, Helena. Truly, you have outdone yourself." I forced a smile. I said, "Thank you. Now seal it back up. Oxygen is the enemy." But Silas didn't seal it. He set the stopper down on the table. He rolled up the sleeve of his expensive Italian suit. He said, "I think we need to be sure. The investors are very particular. I want to test the longevity." My blood ran cold. If he put that perfume on his skin now, within 10 minutes, his body heat would activate the indole. He would smell the rot. He would know I had sabotaged him. He would call the police, and I would never leave this building. I stepped forward, my hand raised. I said, "No, Silas. You can't. The formula is too fresh. It needs to rest for 24 hours. If you put it on skin now, it will cause a reaction. It will burn." It was a desperate lie. Silas looked at me. He looked at the bottle. Then he looked at his bare wrist. He said, "You always were overprotective of your creations. But I am the boss now. And I say we test it." He tilted the bottle. A single golden drop fell from the lip. It fell in slow motion. I watched it fall toward his wrist like a guillotine blade dropping toward a neck. The drop of gold liquid hit his wrist, and I stopped breathing. I watched Silas lift his arm to his nose. He inhaled deeply, and his eyes closed in pleasure. The top notes of bergamot and fresh jasmine were singing their song perfectly, but I knew that in about 30 seconds, the body heat from his pulse point would begin to cook the chemical compound I had hidden inside. The indole would start to bloom. It would smell like a corpse left out in the sun. I counted the seconds in my head. 1, 2, 3. Silas smiled. He opened his mouth to say something triumphant, but suddenly the lab door burst open. It was his personal assistant, and she looked frantic. She was holding a tablet that was pinging loudly. She gasped. "Mr. Thorne, I am so sorry to interrupt, but the legal team from Omnicorp is on the video line. They have a question about the patent filing numbers, and they say they are walking away if you don't answer right now." Silas swore under his breath. The spell was broken. He grabbed a heavy-duty alcohol wipe from the dispenser on the table and scrubbed the perfume off his wrist vigorously. He didn't want to smell like flowers while negotiating a billion-dollar contract. He tossed the wipe into the bin. He pointed a finger at me and said, "Seal that bottle, Helena. Bring it to the boardroom at 10 a.m. sharp tomorrow. Do not be late." He stormed out of the lab. I let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped in my lungs for 10 years. He hadn't smelled the rot. The alcohol wipe had neutralized it just in time. The bomb was still ticking, and Silas had no idea. The next morning, the boardroom on the top floor of the Thorne Tower felt less like a meeting place and more like an execution chamber. The walls were made of floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Mississippi River. The table was a long slab of black marble that looked cold enough to freeze blood. The Omnicorp executives were sitting on one side. They were men in gray suits who looked like they calculated the cost of human souls on spreadsheets. In the center was their CEO, Mr. Vance. He looked impatient. Silas sat at the head of the table. He was practically vibrating with energy. He was wearing a new suit and a smile that cost more than my house. I stood in the corner near the wet bar. I was wearing my white suit again. I held the crystal bottle of Midnight Orchid in my hands. It felt heavy. Lydia was there too. She was standing by the door holding a tray of water glasses. She wouldn't look at me. Her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy. She thought I was a traitor. She didn't know that I was about to burn this room to the ground. Silas stood up and buttoned his jacket. He spread his arms wide. He said, "Gentlemen, today is a historic day. You are not just buying a company. You are buying a legacy. You are buying the most exclusive scent profile in the world. And to prove it, I have asked the creator herself to present the final master batch." He gestured to me. I walked forward. My heels clicked on the marble floor. I set the bottle down in the center of the table. Silas beamed. He said, "Go ahead, Helena. Do the honors." I reached out and removed the wax stopper. A faint puff of scent escaped. I picked up a stack of paper blotters. I dipped them into the bottle one by one. I handed them out to the executives. I gave one to Silas. I stepped back and folded my hands. Silas held the blotter to his nose and inhaled. He closed his eyes dramatically. He said, "Gentlemen, breathe it in. That is the smell of $1 billion. The Omnicorp men sniffed. They nodded. Mr. Vance smiled. He said, "It is exquisite. It has a depth I haven't smelled in years." For 10 seconds, the room was filled with the beautiful aroma of jasmine and vanilla. It was perfect. But the room was hot. The morning sun was beating through the glass walls, and the body heat of 12 nervous men was raising the temperature. And then the indole woke up. It started slowly. Mr. Vance frowned. He sniffed the blotter again, looking confused. He waved it in the air as if trying to clear a bad smell. Then the man next to him coughed. He wrinkled his nose and looked at the bottom of his shoe. Then it hit them all at once. The sweet floral scent curdled. It turned sharp and rancid. It smelled like raw sewage mixed with rotting flowers. It smelled like death. Mr. Vance dropped the blotter as if it had burned him. He gagged loudly, covering his mouth with a handkerchief. He shouted, "What the hell is that?" Silas looked confused. He was still holding his blotter. He sniffed it, and his face turned green. He looked at the bottle. He looked at me. The smell was filling the room now, suffocating and thick. It was inescapable. Mr. Vance stood up so fast his chair fell over backward. He shouted, "Are you trying to poison us? This smells like a slaughterhouse." Silas stammered, No, wait. There must be a mistake. It is just the air conditioning." Mr. Vance grabbed his briefcase. He looked at Silas with pure disgust. He said, "The deal is off, Thorne. If this is your idea of quality control, I wouldn't buy a bottle of water from you. We are leaving." The executives scrambled for the door, coughing and covering their faces. They looked like rats fleeing a sinking ship. Silas stood alone at the head of the table. The smell of his failure hung heavy in the air. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a dawning horror. He realized finally that I hadn't come back to save him. I smiled. It was the first genuine smile I had smiled in years. I said, "I told you, Silas. It is a very delicate formula. It requires a touch of honesty to keep it stable. And you never were a very honest man." The silence that followed the exodus of the Omnicorp executives was heavy and suffocating. The boardroom still smelled faintly of the chemical rot I had engineered, but under that lay the sharper scent of total panic. Silas stood at the head of the table. His hands were gripping the black marble so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at the empty chairs where his billions of dollars had been sitting just moments ago. Then he slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. The charming silver fox was gone. In his place was a cornered animal. He whispered, "You think you have won. You think this is over. I will sue you for everything you have. I will bury you in so much litigation you won't be able to afford a loaf of bread. I still own this company, Helena. I still own the building. I still own you." I walked over to the window and opened it, letting the fresh river breeze cut through the foul air. I took a deep breath. I said, "You don't own anything, Silas. You built your castle on sand, and the tide just came in." Silas laughed. It was a manic, broken sound. He said, "Who is going to stop me?" "You. You are a disgraced old woman with a criminal record. No one will believe you." Suddenly, a voice spoke up from the doorway. It was clear and strong, and it trembled with rage. The voice said, "They won't have to believe her. They will believe the evidence." We both turned. Lydia was standing there. She had put down her serving tray. She was holding her phone in her hand, and her thumb was hovering over the screen. She looked at me, and for the first time in days, her eyes were clear. She understood. She finally saw the long game I had been playing. She walked over to the AV console built into the boardroom table. She didn't look at Silas. She plugged her phone into the system. Silas shouted, "Get away from there! What are you doing?" Lydia pressed play. The voice of Marcus Sterling boomed through the high-quality speakers. It was loud and clear, crisp as a bell. "I am just doing my job, Helena. Silas is my client now. Silas planted the fake bank transfers on your server. He paid off my gambling debts." The recording continued. It captured every word of Marcus's confession in his office 2 days ago. It captured the details of the frame job, the bribes to the zoning commissioner, and the illegal seizure of the Vane estate. Silas went pale. He slumped into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He looked at the speakerphone as if it were a ghost haunting him. The door to the boardroom opened again. This time, it wasn't the investors. It was the board of directors. 3 men and 2 women who had been waiting in the anteroom to toast the sale. They had heard everything. The chairman of the board, a stern man named Arthur, stepped forward. He looked at Silas with cold disgust. He said, "Is this true, Silas? Did you falsify the evidence against Helena 10 years ago?" Silas stammered. He tried to stand up, but his legs wouldn't support him. He said, "It is a fabrication. It is AI. They faked it." Arthur shook his head. He said, "We just received a call from the district attorney. Marcus Sterling turned himself in an hour ago. He is cutting a deal. He gave them everything, Silas. The emails, the bank records, everything." The room seemed to shrink around Silas. The walls were closing in. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Lydia. And finally, he looked at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The look on my face said it all. "Checkmate." Arthur pulled out his phone. He said, "I am calling the police. You are removed as CEO effective immediately, Silas. Don't leave the building." Silas looked down at his hands. He was shaking. His empire was gone. His reputation was incinerated. He was going to prison for a very long time. But then a strange look crossed his face. It wasn't fear anymore. It was madness. He whispered, "If I can't have it, no one can." He suddenly lunged across the table. He wasn't reaching for me. He was reaching for the heavy crystal bottle of the tainted perfume. He grabbed it by the neck like a club. He swung it hard, smashing it against the edge of the marble table. The glass shattered. Shards flew everywhere. The liquid exploded, soaking the carpet and the chairs. The smell of rot intensified instantly, making everyone gag. But Silas didn't stop. He was holding a jagged shard of crystal in his hand. He waved it wildly, keeping Arthur and the board members back. He shouted, "Stay back! All of you!" He scrambled backward toward the private elevator that led directly to the basement, to the lab. I realized what he was doing. The gas lines, the chemicals, the flammables stored in the vault. I shouted, "Lydia, stop him! He is going to the lab. He is going to burn it down!" Silas slammed his hand against the elevator button. The doors slid open. He jumped inside, and the doors closed just as Lydia reached him. We heard the hum of the elevator descending. He was heading for the heart of the building. He was going to destroy the legacy, the journals, and the history of Maison Vane. He was going to turn it all into ash. I kicked off my heels. I looked at Lydia. I said, "Take the stairs. We have to beat him to the basement." My lungs burned like fire as I ran down the emergency stairwell. 68 years is not an age for sprinting, but adrenaline is a powerful drug. I could hear Lydia's footsteps echoing behind me light and fast. We were racing against a madman who had decided that if he couldn't rule the kingdom, he would burn the castle down. We burst through the heavy fire doors into the basement level. The smell hit us instantly. It wasn't the smell of perfume anymore. It was the sharp, stinging scent of industrial ethanol and the sulfurous leak of natural gas. Silas had opened the valves on the Bunsen burners. The lab was a wreck. Glass littered the floor, and there in the center of the chaos stood Silas. He had piled my journals onto the stainless steel work table, the leather-bound books containing 50 years of my life. He was dousing them with a gallon jug of pure alcohol. In his other hand, he held a silver lighter. His eyes were wide and unseeing. He was muttering to himself. He flicked the lighter. A small yellow flame danced into existence. Lydia screamed no and started to rush forward, but I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. I shouted, "Silas, stop! You will kill us all!" He looked up. The flame reflected in his eyes. He smiled a crooked, broken smile. He said, "Let it burn, Helena. Let it all burn. The formulas, the awards, the history. Without me, this company is nothing." He lowered the lighter toward the alcohol-soaked pile of books. I stepped forward. I didn't run. I walked. I needed him to look at me. I needed to break his focus. I said, "Go ahead, Silas. Burn them." He froze. The lighter hovered inches from the paper. He looked confused. He expected me to beg. He expected me to weep for my lost recipes. He said, "These are your babies, Helena. The midnight orchid, the royal rose. You love these books more than you love yourself." I shook my head. I walked until I was standing right in front of him. The gas fumes were making me dizzy, but I stood tall. I pointed at Lydia, who was standing by the door, trembling but brave. I said, "You are wrong, Silas. Those books are just paper and ink. They are the past. She is the future. Lydia has the nose. She has the talent. She doesn't need the journals because I taught her how to read the world with her own senses. You can burn the history, but you cannot burn the talent." Silas looked at Lydia. Then he looked at the pile of wet books. He realized in that moment that his hostage had no value. He realized he had no power over me anymore. His hand started to shake. The flame flickered. He whispered, "I have nothing." I said, "You have a choice. Put out the light and walk away, and maybe the judge will see it as a moment of sanity. Or drop it and die here with the ashes of a company you stole." For a long, terrifying second, I thought he would drop it. I saw the despair in his eyes, but Silas was a coward at heart. He loved his own skin too much to burn. He snapped the lighter shut. The flame vanished. He dropped the lighter on the floor. He slumped against the table, defeated and small. At that moment, the security team and the police burst through the doors. They swarmed the room. I watched as they handcuffed Silas Thorne and led him away. He didn't look back. He was already a ghost. 6 months later, I sat on the stone terrace of my vineyard in Provence. The air smelled of lavender and drying hay and the rich earth of the valley. The sun was warm on my face. I held a phone to my ear. Lydia was on the other end, calling from the CEO's office in New Orleans. She sounded tired but happy. She said, "The rebrand is going well, Grandma. The new version of Midnight Orchid sold out in 3 hours. We can barely keep up with production." I smiled. I took a sip of wine. I said I knew it would. "You have good instincts, Lydia. Trust them." She paused. She said, "When are you coming back to visit? The lab feels empty without you." I looked out over the rows of grapevines stretching toward the horizon. I thought about the noise and the fight and the adrenaline of the corporate world. And then I thought about the peace of my garden. I said, "I am retired, Lydia. Truly this time. My war is over. The company is yours now. Make it something you are proud of." "And Lydia, do me one favor." She asked, "What is it?" I said, "Change the locks." I hung up the phone and closed my eyes. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of freedom. It was the sweetest perfume I had ever known. So, that is my story. I would love to hear what you think. Do you believe that people like Silas ever truly pay for their crimes? Or do you think the system protects the wealthy too much? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. Until next time.